She was 24 and utterly bankrupt. No family safety net, no savings account, no forwarding address. Just a canvas duffel bag and a crumpled $7 bill she had kept hidden inside her left shoe for 3 weeks. And with that $7, she bought a stone windmill stranded on a high ridge in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a structure that had vanished from county tax maps in Mortninchin Salmi. The massive wooden sails were completely broken away, and the heavy grinding mechanism was choked, kep ite hat, dried field dust and rot. The county had condemned the structure, with demolition scheduled for the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow centre of the massive stone grindstone, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're rewatching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Anna Stoltzfus had been bracing for impact her whole life without knowing it. Childhood had not been a place of comfort, but a sequence of quiet, anxious calculations. She grew up in a narrow rented townhouse in a fading industrial suburb of Philadelphia, a place where the concrete sidewalks were always grey and the air perpetually smelled of diesel exhaust and damp brick. Stability was a foreign concept, a luxury afforded to other families who did not check the mailbox with a sense of impending dread. Her father had walked out before she was old enough to form a permanent memory of his face, leaving behind only a few faded Polaroids and a staggering volume of unpaid utility bills. The geography of her youth was defined by the strict parameters of financial survival. She learned to read the subtle shifts in her mother's posture, knowing precisely when the rent was due by the tight, drawn line of her jaw and the deliberate, measured way she poured her morning coffee. Anna did not ask for new clothes or school trips or anything that carried a price tag. She understood, with a profound and premature clarity, that existence was a fragile architecture requiring constant, exhausting maintenance to prevent a total collapse. She learned to navigate the world with a defensive posture, expecting nothing and guarding the few possessions she had with fierce, quiet intensity. Her mother, Sarah, was a woman composed entirely of soft endurance and quiet, uncomplaining exhaustion. She worked 12-hour shifts as a hospital orderly, moving through the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors with a steady, rhythmic pace, trading her physical vitality for minimum wage. When Sarah returned home, her hands smelled of industrial bleach and institutional soap, her shoulders permanently rounded from the heavy lifting of patients and equipment. Despite the crushing weight of their poverty, she fought to maintain a sanctuary of quiet dignity within the cramped townhouse. The floors were scrubbed spotless until the cheap linoleum gleamed, the worn curtains were heavily starched, and she always managed to save a few dollars to buy a small bouquet of Asher Iapeh supermarket carnations for the kitchen table on Sunday morning. Sarah possessed an incredible, quiet resilience, a refusal to let the harshness of the world entirely extinguish her gentleness. She taught Anna that dignity was not tied to wealth, but to the way one maintained their space and treated the people around them. She would sit at the small formica table late at night, rubbing her aching hands, and tell Anna stories about the wide open fields of her own childhood, speaking in a low, soothing voice that offered temporary refuge from the anxiety of the present. But this resilience was physical, and physical strength is a finite resource. When the illness finally arrived, a ruthless, aggressive respiratory condition, it did not merely attack her lungs. It systematically dismantled the fragile economic fortress she had spent decades building. But before the illness, before the crushing descent into medical debt and the sterile hum of the intensive care unit, there had been a brief, beautiful window of safety. There had been her grandfather, Silas. Silas Stoltzfus was a man who seemed carved from the very earth he worked, a figure of immense quiet strength, who carried the scent of crushed wheat and old timber. He had spent his life operating a small commercial grist mill on the outskirts of Lancaster, an occupation that required not just physical endurance but a profound understanding of natural forces. When the chaotic, anxious atmosphere of the Philadelphia townhouse became too suffocating, Sarah would put Anna on a Greyhound bus to spend the summer months with him. Those summers were a revelation. Stepping off the bus into the humid, fragrant air of the Pennsylvania countryside, Anna felt the constant, heavy knot of anxiety in her chest slowly unwind. Silas did not treat her like a fragile child. He treated her like a capable apprentice. The mill was a massive timber-framed structure filled with the deafening roar of grinding stones and the fine white mist of flour that coated every surface like permanent frost. It was a place of heavy, deliberate action. Anna followed him through the sprawling, dusty rooms, learning the complex mechanics of tension and grinding. Silas taught her how to dress the massive stone millstones, using a heavy hand-forged iron pick to carefully chip away the dull edges of the furrows, ensuring the stones ground the grain evenly without burning the flour. He taught her how to listen to the deep, resonant vibration of the running stones, feeling the pulse of the machinery through the wooden floor. "You don't force the stone," Silas told her one afternoon, his thick, calloused hands resting on the heavy wooden hopper. "You guide it. The stone does the work, the grain follows the path, but the miller controls the distance between them. Too tight, and you burn the harvest. Too loose, and you waste the effort. It is all about finding the exact balance, Anna. You must be patient enough to find the balance." She absorbed his teachings with a quiet, fierce dedication. For those brief summer months, she belonged to a world of substance and utility. But stability was an illusion, and when Silas suffered a massive fatal stroke when Anna was 19, the anchor was violently severed. The small commercial mill, heavily leveraged by old debts that Silas had kept hidden from the family, was immediately seized by the regional bank and liquidated at auction. Anna lost not only her grandfather, but the physical sanctuary that had defined her limited sense of security. She did not even have the opportunity to claim his heavy iron millstone pick or the worn leather apron he always wore. The bank padlocked the heavy timber doors before she could arrange a ride back to Lancaster. In the devastating aftermath of his death, her focus was forced to shift entirely back to the cramped townhouse in Philadelphia. Her mother's health had begun its slow, terrifying decline, a persistent cough that gradually evolved into a deep, rattling exhaustion. The memory of the flour dust and the heavy grinding stones was pushed far to the periphery of her mind, buried under the immediate, overwhelming demands of survival. The true antagonist of Anna's life was not a cruel stepfather or a malicious landlord. It was the sprawling, faceless bureaucracy of the American medical system. When Sarah's diagnosis was finally confirmed, the financial devastation was swift and absolute. Anna dropped out of her local community college classes and took a job working the graveyard shift at a massive distribution warehouse, trading her sleep for overtime pay to cover the staggering cost of medications that their basic insurance refused to authorize. The mailbox, once a source of mild anxiety, became a daily delivery mechanism for terror. Thick envelopes with bold red lettering piled up on the small kitchen table, demanding thousands of dollars they did not possess. The collection agencies began calling with relentless, aggressive frequency, their representatives speaking in flat, demanding tones that offered no empathy, only a strict adherence to corporate protocol. Anna learned to navigate the labyrinth of automated phone systems, spending hours on hold, begging for extensions, payment plans, and grace periods. She watched her mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly her entire life, slowly shrink under the combined weight of the illness and the profound shame of insurmountable debt. The townhouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a pressurized chamber of terminal decline. When Sarah finally passed away on a freezing Tuesday morning in late January, the silence in the townhouse was deafening. It was not a silence of peace, but the heavy, crushing silence of a bill that had finally come due. The final grace period expired exactly 14 days after the funeral, The property management company, acting with the swift, impersonal efficiency of an algorithm, filed the necessary paperwork to reclaim the townhouse. Anna had spent the previous night packing the few items of value that had not already been sold to a pawn shop to pay for her mother's final weeks of oxygen therapy. She did not argue with the property manager when he arrived with a uniformed county sheriff's deputy to enforce the eviction order. She moved with mechanical precision, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones, numbing her to the humiliation of the moment. She stood in the center of the immaculate, silent kitchen for the last time. She hoisted her canvas duffel bag over her shoulder. She checked her jacket pocket. She had exactly 7 single-dollar bills remaining from the sale of the small kitchen table. "You need to leave the keys on the counter," the property manager said. His voice clipped and impatient. Checking his watch. Anna placed the J-Harpe brass keys on the worn formica surface. She walked out into the biting wind of the Philadelphia morning and did not look back. The next 6 weeks were a blur of terrifying paranoia and transient exhaustion. Anna became a ghost in her own life, drifting away from the dense urban grid of Philadelphia and moving westward toward the open agricultural expanse of the state. She rode the regional buses as far as the stolen change from abandoned laundromat coin returns would take her, seeking only anonymity and a place where the air did not smell of exhaust and defeat. She spent a week in Harrisburg, sleeping in the back booth of a 24-hour diner, where a sympathetic waitress let her stay until the morning rush, provided she bought a single cup of black coffee. She spent 2 weeks in York, walking the cold, rain-slicked industrial parks, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, listening to the metallic hum of the manufacturing plants. The physical reality of the journey across the state was a brutal exercise in endurance. The landscape was defined by its vast, indifferent scale, the rolling, dormant fields of winter wheat and the dark, imposing ridges of the Appalachian foothills. The latitude brought a sharp, damp quality to the air, and the temperature dropped precipitously the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Anna walked the wide shoulders of the winding rural highways, her thin canvas jacket offering little protection against the biting wind. The only sound was the low, rhythmic roar of the passing long-haul trucks and the occasional sharp cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the barren fields. Every cup of coffee, every packaged sandwich from a glowing vending machine, chipped away at her meager reserves. She learned to calculate survival in increments of quarters and dimes. She slept sitting up in small-town bus terminals, her arms wrapped tightly around her duffel bag, her senses dialed to a heightened, exhausting state of alertness, always watching the door, always expecting to be told to move along. By the end of February, the deep, biting cold of the winter was fully established, and she was down to the $7 folded in her pocket. She visited the small-town employment offices, dispiriting rooms filled with capite-hut-worn linoleum and the smell of stale coffee. The regional economy was largely dependent on seasonal agriculture and light manufacturing, both industries that required local connections, physical bulk, or a permanent address she did not possess. Anna sat in plastic chairs, clutching numbered tickets, watching the quiet desperation of men and women who had lived in the county their entire lives. She didn't wait for her number to be called. She walked out of the offices and headed toward the local library, watching the dark, rolling hills looming against the pale grey sky. The landscape felt permanent and indifferent, a stark contrast to the frantic, paralyzed feeling that had gripped her since the eviction. It was in the basement of a public library in Reading that she saw the advertisement. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the cold wind driving fiercely against the glass, and the library offered a dry, heated sanctuary. Anna sat at a scratched wooden table, absently flipping through a stack of old regional newspapers bound with twine. The paper was the Lancaster County Gazette, dated 3 weeks prior. The classified section was mostly used farm equipment and cordwood sales. But near the bottom of the page, boxed in a thin black border, was a notice of municipal tax auction. The listing was brief, precise, and devoid of sentiment. Property No. 204C. High Ridge Road. Former commercial structure stone windmill. Delinquent taxes $8,000. County scheduled demolition. Sealed bids accepted. Anna stared at the words. Stone windmill. The phrase jumped off the newsprint. A sudden, sharp echo of a life she had been forced to abandon. She read the location again. Lancaster County. She touched the side of her coat pocket. She had exactly $7. It was an irrational thought, a desperate grasp at an impossible lifeline. She had no vehicle, no tools, no winter coat, and no prospect of income. A rural mill that had been abandoned for decades was likely a ruin, a rotting, dangerous shell waiting to collapse. But the memory of Silas' quiet hands, the smell of crushed wheat, the deliberate, patient work of dressing the heavy stone, it rose in her mind with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. It was a clarity that cut through the numbness of the past 6 weeks. It was a place where the medical debt collectors and the property managers could not reach. She walked to the librarian's desk. She borrowed a pen and a single sheet of blank paper. She wrote her name, the property number, and a bid of exactly $7. She folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and spent her last 40 cents in loose change on postage. She dropped the envelope into the brass mail slot near the library entrance. She had cast a line into the dark water, not knowing what, if anything, she might pull. The notification arrived general delivery to the local post office 14 days later. It was a single, crisp sheet of county letterhead stating that her bid had been accepted pending immediate signature and payment in person. She had 3 days to claim the deed. Her journey into the rolling, desolate heart of the Pennsylvania winter was about to begin. The journey deeper into the high ridges of Lancaster County took 2 days of walking along winding county roads, navigating a landscape defined by towering oak trees and dense, freezing fog banks. The late February wind carried a biting chill, sweeping down from the Appalachian foothill. The winter was firmly established, a damp, heavy cold that did not merely settle on the skin, but seemed to penetrate the bone. Anna walked until her boots wore thin, hitching rides when she could kept her heart passing feed trucks and the occasional delivery van, always careful to sit close to the door. On the first night she slept in an abandoned hay barn off Route Barmee, burrowing deep into a pile of dry, dusty straw to escape the frost that coated the wooden siding in pale silver by morning. She listened to the wind rattling the loose metal roof, a harsh, rhythmic thud that offered no comfort. The physical toll of the journey was immense. Every night spent upright in a plastic chair, or huddled under a stairwell chipped away at her physical reserves. Anna's shoulders ached with a deep, permanent throb from carrying the canvas duffel. She tried shifting the weight, sometimes wrapping the heavy strap with a spare shirt to stop it from biting into her collarbone, but the exhaustion was unrelenting. She walked with her head down, leaning into the freezing wind, watching the cracked asphalt of the shoulder road pass beneath her boots. When she finally saw the town limits sign, her legs were trembling with the effort of putting one foot in front of the other. She arrived at the county seat on a Thursday afternoon, under a sky the colour of bruised iron. The town sat in a wide, shallow valley, a grid of red brick and weathered limestone laid over the rolling agricultural land. It was a place that felt solid, heavily battered by the winter, and stubbornly resilient. As Anna walked down the main commercial thoroughfare, she noted the businesses that survived the isolation. There was a farm implement store with window displays of heavy galvanized chain and tractor parts, a diner advertising hot roast beef sandwiches, a narrow pharmacy with a faded wooden sign, a small independent bank constructed of heavy granite. and a feed mill smelling strongly of molasses and grain. The people on the sidewalks moved with purpose, heads down against the wind, wearing heavy wool coats and thick leather boots. The Lancaster County Courthouse Annex stood near the centre of town, a formidable structure of grey limestone verkepi had heavy brass doors that seemed to guard the history of the region. Anna climbed the wide, worn steps, her legs heavy, her hands aching from the cold. The interior of the building was cavernous and quiet, smelling of floor wax, aged paper, and the metallic tang of old cast-iron radiators. The marble floors echoed with her footsteps. She followed the brass plaques on the wall until she found the property records office on the second floor. She pushed open the heavy oak door. The office was warm, the air thick and still. Behind a long wooden counter sat a woman in her late 50s, wearing a heavy cardigan sweater over a collared blouse. A beaded chain held her reading glasses, resting low on her chest. A black plastic nameplate on the counter read, "Margaret Vance, County Clerk." Margaret looked up from a stack of manila folders, her eyes settling on Anna's worn boots, her thin jacket, and the canvas bag she set carefully on the floor. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a practiced, bureaucratic assessment. "Can Mott help you?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the flat, distinct cadence of the Pennsylvania Dutch country. "Mott met here for a property," Anna said, her voice raspy from the cold air and disuse. She pulled the folded county letter from her pocket and slid it across the smooth wood. Number 204C. High Ridge Road. Margaret adjusted her glasses, peering at the letter. She looked at the letter, then at Anna, and then back at the letter. She sighed, a soft sound of weary resignation, and walked over to a wall of grey metal filing cabinet. She pulled open a heavy drawer, her fingers walking over the tabs until she extracted a thick, dust-covered file. She brought it to the counter and opened it flat. "Anna Stoltzfus," Margaret said, reading the name aloud. She looked at Mort Anna over the rims of her glasses. "You understand what you re-buying here, miss. This is to modern house. It's a stone grist mill built over a century ago, sitting right on top of the ridgeline. It hasn't had electricity or running water since the late 60s. The roof is likely failing. The internal timbers are probably rotting, and the county was fixing to tear it down come spring to clear the lot." "Mott understand," Anna said. "The structural integrity might be completely compromised," Margaret continued, her tone pressing, trying to impart the reality of the situation. "The winters out on that ridge are brutal. There's no heat source besides an old field stone fireplace. You can live in a condemned structure without an occupancy permit, and the inspector is going to grant one for a building that does have a solid floor." "Mott have some tools," Anna said, her voice remaining steady. She did not explain her grandfather. She simply held the older woman's gaze. "Mott know how to work with heavy materials. Mott can fix it." Margaret studied her face. She saw the deep exhaustion under her eyes, the sharp angles of her cheekbones, and the quiet, desperate intensity in her posture. She knew the look of someone who had run out of options and was relying entirely on instinct. She sighed again, a heavier sound this time, and pulled a printed form from the file. "The county just wants the liability off the books before it collapses," Margaret said softly, sliding the form toward her. "Sign here." At the bottom. Anna picked up the pen and signed her name. "The delinquent tax amount is exactly $7, Margaret said. Anna reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, worn fabric. She pulled out the 7 crumpled bills, the last physical remnants of her past, and placed them on the wooden. Margaret smoothed the bills out with her hands, placed them in a metal lockbox beneath the counter, and stamped the deed with a heavy, satisfying thwack. She handed her a large, dark iron key that looked incredibly heavy. "The mill is at the very end of High Ridge Road," Margaret told her. "It's the last structure on the property line. The door is heavy oak. It sticks. You have to lift the handle while you turn the key." She paused, looking at the name on the deed one more time. Stoltzfus. "Your people from around here?" "My grandfather ran a commercial mill outside Lancaster," Anna said quietly. "Silas Stoltzfus." Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly. "Silas. Mott remember him. A hard worker. He knew stone." She looked at Anna's thin jacket. "There's a hardware store 2 blocks down. Might want to see if they have any heavy plastic sheeting. The wind comes right through those old stone walls." Anna thanked her, folded the deed into her pocket, picked up her bag, and walked back out into the freezing afternoon. The physical reality of High Ridge Road was a stark, unyielding geography of dormant fields and surging winter wind. It was not a picturesque suburban lane, it was a working county road, defined by function and brutal weather. The air smelled of cold earth, diesel exhaust, and dry frost. Anna walked down the main road, leaving the commercial centre behind, heading toward the older, neglected section of the county. The paved road gave way to cracked asphalt, and then to a wide, uneven track of crushed gravel and dirt. She followed the curve of the ridgeline, passing an occasional farmhouse where a chained dog barked furiously at her approach, until she saw the structure looming at the crest of the hill, framed by massive bare white oak trees. The Windmill sat at the very end of the dirt track, a massive tapering tower that seemed to defy gravity. It was built entirely of heavy, unmortared fieldstone that had turned a pale, ghostly grey from decades of exposure. The building did not sit in a protected valley. It was positioned directly in the path of the prevailing winds, dominating the ridge. The roofline, originally a conical wooden cap designed to rotate, sagged heavily on one side. The massive wooden sails, the defining feature of the mill, were completely broken away, leaving only jagged, rotting stumps protruding from the heavy windshaft. The windows, small square panes designed to withstand the pressure, were cloudy with dust, and several were boarded over with weathered plywood. It looked less like a building, and more like an old, massive fortress that had been permanently defeated by a siege. Anna walked slowly down the long gravel path. The wind roared around the stone tower, the sound echoing in the cold air. She reached the heavy oak door. It was massive, bound in oxidized iron hardware. She inserted the heavy iron key into the lock. She remembered Margaret's instruction. She grabbed the cast iron handle, pulled upward with all her remaining strength, and turned the key. The mechanism engaged with a loud, metallic clack. She leaned her shoulder against the wood and pushed. The door groaned on rusted hinges and swung open, releasing a wave of trapped, freezing air. The interior of the windmill was a vast circular space that immediately dwarfed her. The air inside was completely stagnant, preserving a complex historical scent. Heavy stone dust, dried wheat chaff, oxidized iron, and the sharp, medicinal tang of old grease. The ground floor was dominated by massive wooden beams and the heavy timber framing that supported the upper milling levels. It was completely devoid of interior walls or partitions. The light filtering through the dust-crusted windows cast long, pale beams across the floorboard. In the far curve of the stone wall, near a set of heavy wooden stairs leading to the upper machinery deck, sat an enormous fieldstone fireplace, its chimney venting directly up through the thick masonry. The temperature inside the building was colder than the air outside. The The thick stone walls had trapped the deep winter chill, turning the interior into a sprawling walk-in freezer. Anna knew that admiration of the space was a luxury she could not afford. The sun was dropping fast, and the temperature would plummet within the hour. Her immediate singular priority was physical survival. She set her canvas duffel bay ago down on the floor and walked directly to the fieldstone fireplace. The hearth was filled with decades-old ash, but someone had left a small stack of dry kindling and a few split logs in a wooden bin nearby. She used a torn page from an old magazine she found on the floor and a book of matches from her pocket to start the fire. The dry kindling caught quickly, the flame illuminating the dark stone interior. She fed the fire slowly, adding larger pieces of wood until a steady, roaring blaze was established in the belly of the hearth. The fire began to radiate heat, pushing back against the profound cold of the room. She pulled her duffel bay agur close to the hearth. She had no bed, no mattress, and no blankets besides a thin fleece throw she had packed from the townhouse. She opened the duffel bag and pulled out all her remaining clothing, sweaters, jeans, and heavy socks. She layered them over her body until she looked bulky and awkward, using the remaining clothes as a makeshift mattress on the hard wooden floor. She sat cross-legged near the radiating heat of the fire, her hands wrapped around her knees. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, and the wind began to howl, a low, sustained roar that rattled the small window panes and made the massive timber structure groan. She could hear the heavy thud of the wind hitting the stone walls, a terrifying rhythmic sound that made the entire building vibrate. She was completely alone in a condemned structure, with no money and no plan for the next day. But as she sat there watching the orange glow of the fire spill across the dusty floorboards, a strange, unfamiliar sensation began to settle over her. It was not comfort, and it was certainly not safety. It was the sudden, profound realization of the space was dangerous, freezing and derelict, but it belonged to her. The medical debt collectors could not reach her here. The quiet desperation of the Philadelphia suburbs could not follow her across the threshold. She lay down on her pile of clothes, pulling her jacket tight around her neck, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind moving around the stone tower. Some mills are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The first 3 days in the mill were a frantic, exhausting exercise in establishing the absolute minimum requirements for survival. The structure offered shelter from the wind, but it did not offer comfort. The mornings arrived with a blinding, pale sunlight that illuminated the sheer scale of the mess she had inherited. The ground floor was not empty. It was cluttered with broken wooden gears, rotted canvas sacks, and the heavy detritus of a collapsed industry. Her first task was locating water. She found an old hand pump well in the overgrown brush behind the mill. It required 20 minutes of violent, exhausting pumping, the rusted iron handle screeching loudly in the quiet air, before the mechanism finally drew suction, delivering a stream of freezing, crystal-clear groundwater. She found a dilapidated wooden outhouse 50 yards down the ridge, leaning heavily to one side but functionally intact. Inside the mill, she learned the specific geography of the space. She learned which floorboards groaned under her weight and which window frames rattled when the wind blew from the north. She swept decades of dirt and dried wheat from the central floor, revealing the beautiful rich grain of the old oak planks. By the 4th day, her food supply, a few packets of crackers and a jar of peanut butter she had carried in her duffel, was entirely exhausted. She could not delay the inevitable. She needed supplies, and she had no money to purchase them. She walked the 2 miles back down the dirt track and into town, heading straight for the hardware and general supply store she had seen near the courthouse. The store was a cavernous, dimly lit building smelling strongly of fertilizer, cutting oil, and fresh pine lumber. The aisles were packed tight with heavy galvanized buckets, rows of iron hand tools, and rolls of thick plastic sheeting. Behind the long wooden counter stood the owner, a man in his late 60s with a face that looked as weathered and creased as an old leather saddle. He wore a heavy canvas apron over a plaid flannel shirt, and his hands were thick and permanently stained with grease. His name, according to the hand-painted wooden sign above the register, was Elias Thorne. "Can Mott help you find something?" Elias asked. His voice a low, gravelly rumble. He looked at Anna, taking in her thin jacket and the dirt smudged across her cheek. "Mort needs some supplies," Anna said, her voice steady despite the dry tightness in her throat. "But Mort don't have any money to pay for them today. Mort bought the old stone mill out on High Ridge Road. Mort need to open a line of credit. Mort can work it off. Mort can sweep the floors here, unload trucks, organize inventory, whatever you need." Elias leaned heavy on the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly. He studied her for a long moment. In a small town, a request for credit from a stranger was usually met with immediate, polite refusal. But Elias did not see a grifter. He saw the desperate, focused exhaustion of someone who had completely run out of options and was relying entirely on their willingness to work. "You bought the old mill," Elias stated. It was not a question. The county was going to tear that down. "It's a dangerous structure." "Miss. The roof is open to the weather." "What can er ove kep," Anna said. "Mort met going to fix it." Elias sighed, a sound that carried the weight of decades spent watching people underestimate the harshness of the rural winter. He reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger book. He opened it to a blank page and picked up a pencil. "Name?" he asked. He paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. He looked up at her, the same subtle shift in recognition that Margaret the county clerk had shown. "Stoltzfus. From over Lancaster way?" "My grandfather," Anna said. "Silas." Elias nodded slowly, pressing the pencil down and writing her name in sharp, precise letters. Mort knew Silas. He bought his heavy iron gear grease from me for 20 years, paid his bills on time. He closed the "You can sweep the warehouse out back on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Mort pay $6 an hour. We lung apply it directly to the account." He turned and walked to a small, dusty bookshelf behind the counter. He pulled down a thick, worn paperback manual with a faded yellow cover. He handed it to her. "My brother's old masonry repair guide. He passed away 10 years ago. It explains how to mix mortar for fieldstone. You're going to need it if you want that chimney to draw right without burning the place down." Anna took the book, her fingers brushing against the worn cover. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Elias grumbled, turning back to the register. "Just don't let the fire get out of the box." Anna walked the aisles methodically, taking only what was absolutely necessary for immediate survival. She selected a heavy iron chimney brush Miborn chum num $, a large roll of thick sawmill plastic sheeting tam chum hai $, a box of heavy masonry nails bar chum mort $, a 50-pound bag of dry rolled oats mi hai chum $, a small block of sharp cheddar cheese hai chum bon $, and a heavy wool blanket from the surplus bin mi tam chum $. The total came to exactly $58.35. Elias recorded the amount in the ledger, handed her a receipt, and told her to be there at 6 on Tuesday morning. When Anna returned to the mill, the light was fading rapidly. She knew she could not light another fire until she cleaned the chimney. The previous night S-fire had been small, fueled by dry kindling, but she needed a massive, sustained burn to heat the vast stone room, and a chimney fire in a structure built with dry, century-old timber would be catastrophic. She spent the next 3 hours engaged in grueling, filthy labour. She climbed into the massive fieldstone hearth, using the heavy iron brush to aggressively scrub the interior walls of the flue. The chimney was choked with decades of accumulated creosote, a highly flammable, tar-like substance created by burning unseasoned wood. She worked her way up as far as she could reach, the stiff wire bristles scraping violently against the stone, dislodging thick, black flakes of soot that rained down on her head and shoulders. Her arms ached, her lungs burned from the fine dust, and her face was completely blackened. But she did not stop. She understood the precise danger of creosote. Silas had taught her that a neglected chimney was a silent waiting bomb. When she was satisfied the lower flue was clear, she climbed the heavy wooden stairs to the second floor, and then a precarious ladder to the upper machinery deck, tracing the path of the chimney up through the roof. She checked the masonry joints, looking for any cracks that could let fire escape into the wooden framing. Only when she had inspected every accessible inch did she return to the ground floor. She built a new fire, larger this time, stacking heavy oak logs on the iron grate. She struck a match and watched the flames catch. She waited anxiously, watching the smoke. The chimney drew perfectly, a strong, steady draft pulling the smoke straight up the flue, leaving the air inside the mill clean and sharp. The relief was immediate and profound. She sat close to the hearth, the heat radiating against her soot-stained skin. She used an old tin camping pot she found in the debris to boil water over the coals, mixing in a generous portion of the dry rolled oat. It was a simple, coarse meal lacking salt or sugar, but as she ate the hot oatmeal and a piece of the sharp cheddar cheese, it felt like a feast. It was the first hot meal she had eaten in weeks that she had not begged for or bought with stolen laundry change. The following morning, fortified by the food and the warmth of the heavy wool blanket, Anna began a methodical inventory of the mill's interior. She needed to understand exactly what she possessed. The ground floor was primarily a receiving and storage area, but the true mechanical heart of the building was located on the second level. She climbed the heavy oak stairs, the wood groaning loudly under her weight. The second floor was a sprawling circular room dominated by the massive stationary bedstone and the enormous rotating runner stone that rested on top of it. These were the primary grinding stones, each measuring 5 feet across and weighing over 2,000 pounds. They were encased in a heavy wooden vat designed to contain the flour as it was ground. Anna walked around the massive wooden structure, her hands trailing over the thick, dust-covered timbers. She found a heavy wooden workbench built into the curve of the stone wall. The bench was littered with the specialized, heavy tools of the milling. She found massive iron spanner wrenches, heavy wooden mallets, and thick leather driving belts coiled like sleeping snakes. In a set of deep wooden drawers she found smaller precision tools, brass calipers, heavy steel files, and a collection of iron wedges used to perfectly balance the massive stone. Every object she uncovered was a physical link to a specific kind of heavy, deliberate labour. A poorly balanced millstone did not merely produce bad flour, it could vibrate violently, shaking the entire timber frame of the mill apart. The tools were heavy because the forces they controlled were immense. She spent hours organizing the tools, laying them out on the clean workbench, mentally categorizing them according to the lessons Silas had taught. The sheer volume of the machinery was overwhelming, but the logic of the layout was familiar and deeply comforting. It was late in the afternoon, while she was cleaning the heavy wooden vat that encased the massive grinding stones, that she noticed the anomaly. She had removed the heavy wooden cover panels to inspect the massive 5-foot diameter runner stone. The stone was carved from a single piece of heavy French burr, the preferred material for high-quality flour milling due to its extreme hardness and porosity. The surface was covered in complex geometric grooves called furrows, designed to shear the grain. But it was the center of the stone, the eye where the grain was traditionally fed, that caught her attention. The eye of a runner stone is typically a hollow opening, allowing the grain to drop down between the spinning stones. But the eye of this massive stone was not hollow. It was completely filled, sealed flush with a smooth, hard layer of white plaster. Anna frowned, leaning closer in the dim light. Plaster had absolutely no functional place on the grinding surface of a millstone. It was a brittle material that would shatter instantly under the immense pressure of the milling process. The presence of the plaster indicated that the stone had not only been intentionally disabled, but that something had been sealed inside the hollow core before the plaster was applied. She stood back, wiping her dusty hands on her jeans. She walked over to the heavy wooden workbench and picked up a heavy iron chisel and a wooden mallet. She returned to the massive stone, kneeling beside the sealed eye. She placed the sharp edge of the iron chisel against the white plaster and struck the back of the handle firmly with the wooden mallet. The sound was sharp and resonant, a dry, flat crack that echoed in the circular room. She struck it again, harder this time. The surface of the plaster spider-webbed with fine hairline cracks. She worked carefully, methodically chipping away at the edges of the seal, avoiding striking the valuable French burr stone. It took nearly an hour of focused, exhausting labour before the main block of plaster finally broke loose with a heavy, crumbling thud, exposing a dark, cylindrical cavity approximately 14 inches deep and 8 inches wide in the very centre of the massive stone. Anna set the tools down, her heart beating a fast, unsteady rhythm in her chest. She blew the heavy white dust away from the opening and reached her hand down into the cold, dark stone cavity. Her fingers brushed against something wrapped in heavy, oiled canvas. She gripped the rough fabric and pulled. The object was heavy, wedged tightly into the hole. She had to use both hands, bracing her boots against the heavy wooden vat, pulling upward with a sustained, straining effort until the canvas-wrapped bundle finally slid free. She laid it carefully on the wooden floorboards. She reached back into the cavity. There was a second bundle, smaller but heavier, wrapped in the same dark oiled canvas. She pulled it out and set it next to the first. Finally, resting at the very bottom of the hole, she felt the smooth, cold surface of a small metal box. She extracted the box, her hands trembling slightly, and set it beside the two bundles. She sat back on her heels, staring at the objects resting on the dusty floor. The air in the loft was completely still, the silence broken only by the low, distant roar of the wind outside. She had forced open a sealed vault, violating a deliberate act of preservation designed by a miller who had stood in this exact spot decades before she was born. She reached for the first, longest canvas bundle. The fabric was stiff and smelled strongly of old machine oil and dry earth. She carefully untied the thick hemp cord binding it and unrolled the canvas. Inside lay a heavy hand-forged iron millstone pick. It was a masterpiece of specialized blacksmithing, the iron dark and pitted with age, the two sharp cutting edges perfectly maintained and coated in a thin layer of protective grease. The wooden handle was worn smooth, shaped perfectly to fit the grip of a man's hand. It was an heirloom tool, the essential instrument required to dress the massive stones and keep the mill functioning. It was not merely a piece of metal, it was the physical manifestation of the miller's craft. She picked up the heavy iron tool, feeling the perfect balance in her hand. It felt exactly like the pick her grandfather Silas had used, a tool that had been denied to her by the bank's padlocks. She placed it gently back on the canvas. She turned to the second, heavier bundle. She unrolled the stiff fabric. Inside were 3 neat, rectangular stacks of paper currency, bound tightly with brittle, yellowed paper bands. Anna stared at the money, her mind struggling to process the sudden, overwhelming reality of the paper. She picked up the first stack. The bills were not modern. They featured the smaller, older portraits, the ink a faded, classic green, the paper stiff and crisp. She counted the stack, her hands moving mechanically, her breath shallow. 10, 20, 30, 40 stacks in total across the 3 bundles. $40,000 in perfectly preserved vintage currency sealed inside a massive stone while the man who hid it allowed the building around him to fall into ruin. She laid the bundles out on the floorboards. It was more cash than she had ever seen in her life. It was a sum that could instantly erase the terrifying precarity of her existence. It could buy a reliable vehicle, a heated apartment, a winter coat, a return to the safety of the urban grid. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the financial relief hit her like a physical blow, bringing tears to her eyes that she angrily wiped away with the back of her dirty hand. Finally, she picked up the small metal box. It was a simple, unadorned tin box. The metal oxidized to a dull, mottled grey. She pried the tight-fitting lid open. Inside, resting on a folded piece of heavy parchment, was a small, bronze military medal suspended from a faded ribbon of red, white, and blue. She recognized the shape from history books. It was a silver star awarded for gallantry in action. The back of the medal was engraved with a name and a year, Motnin Chin Mui Tai. Beneath the medal lay a heavy, leather-bound logbook, the cover stained and worn smooth by years of handling. She opened it carefully, the thick pages crackling slightly. The entries were written in a sharp, precise, forward-leaning script, recording wind speed, barometric pressure, and daily grain yields. It was a Master Miller S. personal ledger, detailing the performance of the mill over decades. And folded neatly inside the front cover of the logbook was a thick, yellowed envelope sealed with dark red wax. Anna did not break the wax seal. Not then. The sun had fully set, and the temperature inside the stone tower was dropping rapidly. She gathered the cash, the iron pick, the medal and the logbook, carrying them carefully down the heavy wooden stairs to the ground floor. She placed them on the hearth, near the glowing embers of the fire she had built earlier. She fed more heavy oak logs into the flames, building a massive roaring fire that pushed the deep chill back to the edges of the room. She took the sealed envelope and walked to the heavy oak door. She pulled it open, stepping out into the freezing, violent wind of the Pennsylvania night. She walked to the edge of the ridge, looking out over the dark, rolling expanse of the valley. The landscape was vast and indifferent, a sea of black earth and dormant fields, under a sky blazing with hard, cold stars. She held the thick parchment envelope in her hand, feeling the weight of the history it contained. The man who wrote this letter had stood exactly where she was standing, feeling the same wind, watching the same valley, before making the deliberate, irreversible decision to silence his massive stone machine and seal his wealth inside its heart. She needed the clarity of the morning light to read his words. She needed the physical exhaustion of the day to settle before she could properly receive the inheritance. She returned to the mill, locked the heavy oak door, and lay down on her makeshift bed of layered clothing near the roaring fire. She pulled the heavy wool blanket she had bought from Elias over her shoulders, the thick fabric trapping the heat perfectly. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind battering the stone walls, the heavy iron key resting securely in her pocket. Some mills are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The morning arrived with a blinding pale sunlight that illuminated the sheer scale of the stone structure. Anna woke early, her breath pluming white in the cold air, the fire in the hearth having burned down to a bed of glowing red coal. She fed a few pieces of dry kindling into the embers, watching the flames catch before making a cup of instant coffee using water from the hand pump outside. She sat cross-legged near the radiating heat of the fire, the heavy wool blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and picked up the thick, yellowed envelope. The wax seal was brittle with age, cracking instantly as she slid her thumb beneath the flap. She pulled out 4 sheets of heavy stationery paper, covered in the same sharp, precise, forward-leaning script she had seen in the leather-bound logbook. The ink was dark blue, written with a fountain pen that had occasionally caught and scratched against the thick paper, leaving tiny dried splatters of ink near the margins. Anna smoothed the heavy paper flat on her knee, took a deep breath, and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have broken the seal on this stone, it means you possess either the heavy iron chisel or the sheer stubborn physical force necessary to break a Master S plaster seal. Either way, it tells me that you are not afraid of heavy work, and that you understand the mechanics of this mill better than the county clerks who will inevitably try to tear it. My name is Jacob Miller. Mott operated these heavy stones for 40 years. Mort dressed the French burr with the iron pick you now hold, feeling the exact vibration of the grind, knowing precisely how to set the distance to produce flour fine enough for the city bakers and meal coarse enough for the valley farmers. Mort knew the tension of every wooden gear, the exact breaking point of the massive windshaft, and the precise angle required to catch a trailing autumn breeze. Mort built a life on the reliable, predictable power of the wind. But Mott could not build a mechanism strong enough to save my son, or to reverse the devastation of a broken sky. My grandfather, Wilhelm M. Yeller, arrived in this valley from the Rhineland in Mortneentam-bon-Mihai, bringing nothing but the iron pick and a deep ancestral knowledge of stone. He built the foundation of this tower. My father, Johannes, raised the heavy timber frame in Mortneentam-bei-Misau. We are a family defined entirely by the rotation of the sails and the quality of the harvest. We survived the lean years, the heavy snows, and the shifting economies of the passing decades. In Mortneentam, my son David went across the ocean to fight in a war he did not understand. He fought in the heavy, poisoned mud of the Argonne forest. He was a miller's son, accustomed to the clean, sharp smell of fresh wheat, forced to endure the absolute horror of industrial slaughter. He saved 4 men from a collapsed trench under heavy artillery fire on October Muibon Chunghope of that year. The government gave him the silver star you now hold in your hand. He survived the war, but he returned to this ridge a fractured man. The heavy noise of the grinding stones terrified him. The smell of the flour dust made him choke, reminding him of the white choking gas of the trenches. He could not work the mill. He sat near the hearth, staring into the flames, his hands trembling, his spirit broken. Mott watched him slowly fade, unable to mend the damage the world had done to him. He died in the winter of Mortneentam, a casualty of a war that had ended 10 years prior. When David died, Mott continued to turn the stones, fueled by a heavy, unyielding grief. But then came the summer of Mortneentam. It was the year the wind turned to fire. The heat wave settled over the valley in July and did not break. The temperatures soared above 100 degrees for weeks. The fields of wheat turned to dry, brittle ash. The wind, usually a cool, reliable source of power, became a destructive, searing force, blowing hot dust across the ridge, choking the mechanisms and ruining the meagre harvest. The farmers brought me nothing but shriveled, useless grain. The community starved, the animals died, and the sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue. Mort stood in the upper loft, watching the hot wind tear across the barren fields, and Mort realized that the compact between the earth and the miller had been broken. Mort could not grind dust into sustenance. Mort could not turn the stones to feed a valley that had nothing left. The The grief of losing my son, compounded by the profound, devastating failure of the harvest, broke my hand. Mort could no longer feel the tension in the stone. Mort could no longer look at the massive wooden sails without seeing the hot, destructive wind that had ruined our lives. Mort closed the heavy oak door. I locked the massive wooden brake. Mort took the savings Mort had accumulated over 40 years. The cash meant to modernize this operation for David, and Mort sealed it inside the very material that defined our existence. Mort knew the county would eventually seize the building for taxes. Mort knew the town would want to tear it down, to erase the old stone in favor of modern, sterile steel structures. But Mort also knew that heavy plaster does not rot, and that the center of a millstone is the safest vault a man can build. The money surrounding you is not a lottery ticket, it is an inheritance of labor. It is the physical manifestation of 10,000 hours spent lifting heavy sacks of grain, breathing stone dust, and dressing the hard French beurre until my hands bled. If you are reading this, it means you have entered a derelict space and possessed the curiosity and the strength to look beneath the rock. Do not use this money to run away. The world is full of people running away from a broken sky, seeking comfort in places where the air is perfectly still and requires no effort. But a life lived entirely in the calm is a fragile thing. If you choose to stay, you must understand the stone. The French beurre requires a delicate hand. When you dress the stone, strike at a perfect 45-degree angle, no deeper than a quarter inch. When you set the gap between the bedstone and the runner, use a heavy piece of parchment paper as your guide. If the paper pulls with heavy resistance but does not tear, the tension is correct. The speed of the sails must never exceed 15 revolutions per minute in a high wind, or the friction will burn the flour and destroy the harvest. Use the funds to repair the roof. Hire the local men to replace the broken wooden sails. Oil the heavy gears and grease the massive windshaft. Bring the sound of the grinding stones back to this ridge. Build something that can withstand the weather, both on the fields and in your own heart. The mill is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Written this Muiborn Chunghup day of October, in the year Matneen Chin Barmisau. Anna read the final line, the heavy silence of the stone tower pressing in around her. She read the letter a second time, her eyes tracing the elegant, faded blue ink, absorbing the profound weight of the man's grief and his desperate hope for the future. She did not. The emotion she felt was deeper than tears. It was a solid grounding sensation, a recognition of shared endurance. She carefully folded the heavy parchment back along its original deep creases and placed it gently into the envelope. She set the envelope next to the silver medal and the leather logbook on the hearth. She stood up, her legs stiff from the cold floor, and walked to the heavy oak door. She pushed it open and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The wind was sharp, cutting across the ridge, but she did not retreat. She walked around to the back of the massive stone tower, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, searching the overgrown brush. Jacob had mentioned a physical marker in his logbook, a small stone obelisk where he had buried David S. old army compass. She found it near the rusted hand pump, covered in thick, thorny briars. She knelt in the freezing dirt, using her bare hands to pull the sharp briars away, ignoring the small cuts on her palms, until the simple, weathered stone marker was visible. She did not dig for the compass. Acknowledging the marker was enough. It was a physical confirmation of the history she had inherited. She returned to the mill, shivering violently, and walked over to the wooden workbench where she had organized the heavy iron tools. She picked up the heavy hand-forged millstone pick she had pulled from the canvas bundle. It felt cold and solid in her hand. She walked back to the hearth, sitting close to the fire. She pulled a small, rusted iron lantern she had found earlier from her duffel bag. She filled it with a small amount of kerosene she had purchased from Elias Thorne, struck a match, and lit the thick cotton. She watched the small, steady yellow flame flicker inside the dirty glass chimney, casting long dancing shadows against the massive stone wall. As she watched the flame, her mind drifted back over the past 6 weeks. She thought about the terrifying isolation of the journey, the freezing nights spent huddled under stairwells, the constant, paralyzing fear of starvation. But she also thought about the specific, quiet acts of grace that had allowed her to survive. She thought about the waitress in Harrisburg who had silently refilled her coffee cup for 3 hours without asking for payment. She thought about the truck driver who had given her a ride across the Susquehanna River, offering her half of a foil-wrapped sandwich without making eye contact. She thought about Margaret at Clark S. office, who had not judged her worn boots, and Elias Thorne, who had extended a line of credit to a stranger purely on the strength of her grandfather's name. These were not grand, heroic gestures. They were small, quiet moments of human decency, tiny anchors thrown into a violent sea. They were the precise opposite of the cold, impersonal bureaucracy of the medical billing departments and the eviction notices. They were the reasons she was sitting in a stone tower, holding $40,000 and a letter from a man who had died decades ago. Before we continue, Mort want to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced a small, unexpected kindness from a stranger that completely altered the trajectory of your day, or perhaps your life? A moment when someone chose empathy over indifference? Please share that story in the comments below. These acts of quiet grace are the true foundation of our communities, and reading about them reminds us of the profound power we hold to help one another through the darkest winters. Anna pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, the warmth of the fire finally penetrating the deep chill in her bones. She arranged her makeshift bed of clothing on the floorboards, placing the heavy iron pick, the Silver Star medal, and the yellowed envelope carefully beside. She did not hide the money back in the stone cavity. She caepete it in the heavy vinyl dry bag inside her duffel, resting near her head. She lay down, listening to the wind howling around the massive stone tower. She was no longer a bankrupt, evicted girl running from debt. She was the custodian of the Miller grist mill, and she had work to do. The restoration of a massive stone windmill is not a project that can be rushed by enthusiasm or accelerated by sudden wealth. It requires a slow, deliberate accumulation of materials, physical endurance, and a profound respect for the structural geometry established a century prior. The mill had been decaying since Mortnin Chinbamisau. It would not be healed in a week. Anna's first action was establishing financial security without drawing unwanted attention. She carried the heavy vinyl bag into the independent bank in town, depositing $35,000 into a commercial L account and placing the remaining $5,000 along with the medal and the logbook in a steel safety deposit box. The branch manager, a severe-looking man in a tight suit, did not ask questions when the quiet girl in the worn canvas jacket presented the vintage, uncirculated bills. In a rural county, sudden windfalls were treated with a polite, absolute silence. With the capital secured, the physical labor began. The most critical failure of the structure was the conical wooden roof cap, which had sagged heavily under the weight of decades of accumulated snow, allowing the freezing winter rain to penetrate the heavy timber framing. She could not repair the massive structural beams alone. She needed expertise. She returned to Elias Thorne's hardware store. She sat on an overturned galvanized bucket in the back warehouse, using a thick Carpenter S pencil to calculate the square footage of the conical roof on a torn brown paper feed bag. Elias watched her work, noting the precision of her measurements and her understanding of complex angles. "You're going to need heavy white oak for the main rafters," Elias said, leaning against a stack of pine lumber. "And you can use modern dimensional lumber to sister those old beams. It won to hold the weight of the stone." "Motkano ove kep," Anna said, looking up from the paper bag. "Mort need rough sawn timbers." true 2x8s. And Mott needs someone who understands how to build scaffolding on a pitched stone wall. Elias nodded slowly. He did not recommend a contractor. He simply closed the store early on a Thursday afternoon, loaded his heavy flatbed truck with massive oak timbers, and drove out to High Ridge Road himself. The work was agonizingly slow and physically punishing. For 11 consecutive days, Anna and Elias lived in a state of perpetual shivering exhaustion. The wind off the ridge was relentless, driving freezing spray across the stone walls. They set up heavy metal scaffolding that hung precipitously over the edge of the tower. They used heavy hydraulic jacks to lift the sagging corners of the massive conical cap by microscopic fractions of an inch, taking the weight off the rotting original timbers so the new oak could be bolted into place. Anna was there every morning at dawn, wearing a heavy insulated Carhartt jacket she had purchased in town, her hands encased in thick leather work gloves. She did not direct the work, she simply did whatever Elias told her to do. She hauled heavy buckets of specialized marine epoxy up the slippery scaffolding. She learned the specific, terrifying sound of heavy wood under extreme compression, the loud pistol shot cracks as the building settled into its new alignment. The most dangerous work involved sistering the main rafters high above the grinding floor. Elias taught her the specific techniques required for historic timber framing. They did not use modern nail guns. They used heavy steel framing hammers, driving thick, galvanized nails through the dense oak with a precise rhythm. Set the nail, drive it deep, sink the head. 3 strokes per nail. They snapped blue chalk lines across the heavy wooden decking to ensure perfect alignment, staggering the joints of the heavy cedar shingles to prevent water penetration during driving storms. The height was terrifying, the air thick with the smell of ancient dry wood and fresh cut. But as the heavy steel bolts were tightened, drawing the sagging timbers back into true alignment, Anna felt a profound shift in the atmosphere of the building. The terrifying structural groans began to subside. The building felt tighter, more solid against the wind. With the conical roof cap secured and the building sealed against the immediate threat of water damage, Anna turned her attention to the massive fieldstone chimney. The structure was functionally intact, but decades of disuse and the aggressive freeze-thaw cycles of the Pennsylvania winters had severely degraded the mortar joints, creating dangerous voids where fire could escape into the timber frame. The repair required a specific historic approach. Modern Portland cement, rigid and unforgiving, would trap moisture and eventually cause the softer fieldstone to crack and spall. Anna sat close to the hearth at night, reading the worn paperback masonry manual Elias had given her by the light of the kerosene lantern, studying the complex chemistry of historic binding. She purchased raw, unslaked lime, clean river sand, and heavy bags of specialized fire clay from the hardware store. The process of slaking the lime was dangerous, generating intense chemical heat that bubbled and hissed in the heavy galvanized mixing tubs. She carefully mixed the flaked lime with the sand and pure rainwater she had collected in barrels, creating a soft, breathable mortar for the main exterior shaft. For the interior firebox, which had to withstand extreme temperatures, she mixed the dense, heavy fire. The repointing process consumed 3 weeks of late March, the temperatures hovering stubbornly in the low 20s. Anna worked methodically, starting from the massive stone base and climbing the scaffolding up the side of the. She used a specialized narrow pointing trowel to meticulously pack the wet mortar deep into the empty joints, striking the surface smooth to shed water. The physical reality of the work was a brutal display of endurance. She could not wear thick insulated gloves while handling the delicate trowel, so she wore thin cotton liners that offered no protection against the freezing. Her bare hands went completely numb every 15 minutes, forcing her to climb down the scaffolding and hold them over the small fire in the hearth until the painful burning sensation of returning circulation subsided. Her knuckles split and bled, her fingernails became packed with grey lime dust, and her shoulders throbbed with a deep permanent ache from reaching overhead. But she did not stop. She moved from stone to stone, packing the mortar tight, sealing the massive chimney against the wind. When the final joint at the very top of the flue was struck smooth, she climbed down the scaffolding for the last time. She waited 3 full days for the fire clay in the hearth to cure completely before building a massive test fire. She stacked dry oak logs high, struck a match, and watched the flames roar to life. She went outside and stared up at the top of the stone tower. The smoke poured cleanly from the chimney, a thick white plume rising straight up into the cold blue sky. Not a single wisp of smoke escaped through the newly pointed masonry joints. The chimney was safe, the fortress was secure. The foundation of the mill was solid stone, but the primary workspace, the massive circular floor where the heavy sacks of grain would eventually be moved and the machinery operated, was constructed of thick, old-growth white pine planks. The boards were incredibly wide, some measuring 14 to 20 inches across, secured directly to the massive oak joists, but decades of neglect, dripping water from the failed roof, and the heavy accumulation of ground in dirt and oxidized grease had turned the beautiful wood into a dark, splintering hazard. Anna knew the floor had to be structurally perfect. A weak floorboard under the immense vibration of the running stones was a catastrophic liability. She spent 2 entire days crawling across the vast expanse on her hands and knees, testing every single wide plank for rot or deflection. She used a heavy steel pry bar to carefully lift the boards that were too damaged to save, exposing the heavy, hand-hewn joists beneath. She replaced the damaged sections vekepite, hat-rough sawn pine. She ordered specially through Elias, taking care to secure them not with modern screws, but with expensive hand-cut rose-head nails that she drove flush into the wood, matching the historical integrity of the building. Once the structural repairs were complete, the grueling process of resurfacing began. Anna rented a massive, heavy-duty industrial drum sander from a rental yard in town for $14 a day. The machine was incredibly heavy, difficult to control, and prone to gouging the soft pine if she allowed it to rest in one place for even a fraction of a second. She strapped on a heavy canvas dust mask, protective goggles, and ear protection, and engaged the heavy motor. She worked systematically, making 3 distinct passes over the entire circular floor. The first pass was brutal, using an aggressive 80 grit paper that tore through the decades of black grime and deep splinters, generating massive clouds of thick, choking dust that coated the stone walls. The machine bucked and fought her grip, her arms vibrating violently with the effort of controlling the heavy drum. The second pass, using a medium 120 grit paper, smoothed out the deep scratches left by the first. The final pass, using a fine 220 grit paper, polished the wide pine planks to a smooth, buttery finish. The physical exertion of wrestling the heavy sander across the massive floor pushed her to the absolute limit of her endurance. There was one bad morning, late in April. Anna woke up on her makeshift bed, the fire completely dead, the air inside the mill freezing cold. Her hands were raw, covered in deep blisters from the vibration of the heavy machine, her shoulders locked in a permanent, agonizing cramp. The sheer overwhelming scale of the project suddenly felt impossible. The silence of the stone tower was not comforting, it was isolating and She did not build a fire, she did not put on her work boots. She put on her thin canvas jacket, walked out the heavy oak door, and hiked down the ridge to a small, quiet creek that wound through the valley. She sat on a cold, damp rock at the edge of the moving water for hours, her raw hands buried deep in her pockets, staring blankly at the surface. She watched a small, black-capped chickadee moving nervously through the branches of a bare willow tree, its tiny, sharp chirps the only sound in the freezing air. The bird was fragile, existing entirely at the mercy of the harsh environment, yet it moved with a frantic, necessary purpose. Anna sat completely still, allowing the deep exhaustion and the terrifying doubt to wash over her. She did not fight it, she simply existed in the quiet failure of the morning. When the sun began to drop behind the ridge, she stood up, walked back to the massive stone tower, and slept. The next morning she finished the final pass with the sand. To protect the raw wood, she did not use modern polyurethane which would sit on the surface and eventually chip under the heavy iron tools. She used pure, high-grade tung oil. She mixed the thick amber liquid in a clean metal bucket, thinning the first coat by exactly 25% with mineral spirits to allow the oil to penetrate deep into the cellular structure of the old pine. She applied 3 heavy coats, working on her hands and knees with a clean rag, pushing the oil deep into the wood grain. The smell of the tung oil was sharp and nutty, a clean preserving scent. She allowed the floor a full 48 hours to cure completely before walking on it. The finished floor was a masterpiece, the wide pine boards glowing with a warm amber light, a solid, beautiful foundation for the heavy work to come. The windmill was punctuated by 8 small, deep-set windows piercing the thick stone walls, designed to provide cross-ventilation and necessary light without compromising structural integrity. Over the decades, the weather and the vandalism of time had taken a heavy toll. 3 of the sashes were completely missing, leaving jagged holes open to the elements. 4 contained cracked, cloudy glass held in place by brittle, failing putty. Only 1 window, high on the second floor, contained a single pane of original, machine-rolled glass dating back to the early 20th century, its surface slightly wavy and imperfect. Anna measured the missing frames ver capite at precise care and ordered custom, solid wood replacement sashes from a regional millwork shop. For the cracked windows, she undertook the delicate, frustrating process of historic glass repair. She set up a clean workspace on her newly finished pine floor, laying out the heavy wooden sashes. She used a specialized heat gun and a stiff putty knife to carefully soften and remove the rock-hard, decades-old glazing compound, taking extreme care not to damage the fragile wooden muntins that held the small pane. Once the frames were clean and primed with heavy oil-based paint, she began the installation. She did not use modern silicone caulk. She used DAP 33, a traditional oil-based glazing putty that required significant hand strength to knead into a warm, pliable consistency. She learned to press the thick putty firmly against the glass and the wood, and then use the sharp edge of a glazing knife to draw a perfectly smooth, angled line, creating an impermeable seal against the driving rain. She replaced the broken sash cords, the vital ropes hidden inside the window frames that connected the heavy sashes to cast iron counterweights, allowing the windows to open and close smoothly. She used traditional tightly braided cotton cord, tying a complex figure 8 knot at the end to secure it permanently into the weight. On the 20th of April, she installed the final restored window on the ground floor. She stood back, wiping her hands on a clean rag. The afternoon sun caught the fresh glass, casting a brilliant warm square of light across the glowing pine floorboard. For the first time she could see clearly out across the ridge. Through the new pane she watched a small, vibrant cardinal land on the bare branch of a white oak, a brilliant flash of red against the grey bark. The interior of the mill was no longer a dark, freezing cave. It was a sealed, illuminated space, claiming its place in the landscape. While the exterior walls of the mill were heavy, unmortared fieldstone, portions of the interior, specifically the areas framing the massive chimney on the ground floor, had originally been finished with smooth plaster to reflect light and provide a cleaner surface against the masonry. Decades of heavy water intrusion before the roof was repaired had severely damaged 3 large, prominent sections of this interior wall. The old plaster had bubbled, cracked, and finally fallen away in heavy sheets, exposing the thin, horizontal wooden lath strips. Repairing the damage required a material that matched the exact historical composition of the original structure. Modern drywall compound would not adhere properly to the flexible wooden lath, and it lacked the necessary structural strength. Anna researched the traditional methods and purchased heavy bags of dry plaster powder, specifically formulated with a traditional mix of lime, fine sand, and, crucially, a binder of strong horsehair. The hair provided essential tensile strength, preventing the heavy, wet plaster from sagging and cracking as it cured over the uneven lath. The application was a grueling three-step process that demanded intense physical stamina and a specific, fluid wrist motion she had to learn through repeated failure. She mixed the heavy, wet plaster in a large galvanized trough until it reached the consistency of thick, stiff dough. The first layer, known as the scratch coat, was pushed aggressively into the narrow gaps between the wooden lath strips, creating a strong mechanical key that held the weight of the material. Before the scratch coat dried completely, she used a specialized metal comb to score deep, horizontal grooves across the surface. The second layer, the brown coat, was applied 2 days later, building the thickness of the wall and establishing a level surface, filling the deep scratch. She used a long wooden straight edge, sliding it heavily across the wet plaster to ensure the wall was perfectly flat. The final finish coat was applied extremely thin, using a smooth steel trowel. She worked quickly, misting the surface with a small bottle of water and burnishing the plaster until it became incredibly hard and smooth, blending seamlessly into the surrounding, intact historical wall. When the third patch was finally finished, the white surface drying clean and hard against the dark stone of the chimney, Anna stood back, her arm aching with a deep, lactic burn. She ran her hand over the cold, perfectly smooth surface. She knew the chemical bond was secure. She knew the horsehair would hold the tension. These patches will hold another 100 years. Some mills are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The restoration of the windmill was an isolating, deeply personal endeavour, but it did not occur in a vacuum. The massive stone tower, perched high on the ridge, was highly visible to the surrounding valley. The local community, initially viewing the purchase with a mixture of skepticism and quiet amusement, gradually began to understand the serious, unyielding nature of the work being done. In a rural Pennsylvania county, respect is rarely given easily, but it is reliably earned through visible, sustained physical labor. The shift in the community's attitude did not manifest in grand gestures, but in a series of quiet, deliberate intersections. Doris Kaufman operated the small, independent diner on the main highway, a place defined by its heavy ceramic coffee mugs and the permanent smell of bacon grease. Anna had occasionally spent her dwindling cash on a cheap hot meal there during the early freezing days. Sometime in early May, Anna woke up, opened the heavy oak door to check the morning weather, and found a heavy, foil-wrapped package sitting on the bottom stone step. Inside was a massive slice of dense, hot meatloaf, a side of roasted potatoes, and a thick cut of homemade cherry pie. There was no note. This quiet delivery became a semi-regular occurrence, appearing twice a week, usually on the days following a particularly brutal storm or an obvious delivery of heavy material. When Anna finally managed to catch Doris walking back to her rusted sedan after leaving a package, she tried to press a $5 bill into the older woman's hand. Doris looked at the money, then at Anna's calloused hands, and shook her head, a sharp, dismissive motion. "You need your strength to lift that oak, girl. The pie is a write-off. Eat it while it's hot." She got in her car and drove away without waiting for a thank you. Caleb was a 17-year-old boy who lived on a sprawling dairy farm 3 miles down the ridge. He was all sharp angles and quiet, nervous energy, possessing the awkward, immense strength of a boy raised entirely on manual labor. He appeared on a Saturday morning in late May, driving a battered, faded red pickup truck that sounded like a tractor. The bed of the truck was loaded Vacapite hat heavy, split rounds of seasoned oak firewood. He backed the truck up to the mill, turned off the engine, and began silently unloading the heavy wood, stacking it neatly near the door. Anna watched him for 10 minutes before walking out. She asked him how much he wanted for the Caleb paused, wiping his forehead with the back of a dirty leather work glove. He looked at the massive stone tower, then at the ground. My mother said her family used to buy flour from your grandfather down in Lancaster. She said he never shorted a weight even during the bad years. She told me to bring the wood. He didn't ask for money and he didn't stay to talk. He returned every other Saturday, a silent, reliable engine of physical support. Reverend Boyd was a tall, incredibly thin man with a shock of white hair who served as the pastor for a small independent Methodist congregation down in the valley. He was an avid walker, his daily route taking him up the steep grade of High Ridge Road. He did not preach, and he did not pray. His interactions with Anna were brief and entirely consistent. Every morning at exactly 7:30, as Anna was hauling water from the pump or sweeping the stone dust from the front steps, Reverend Boyd would walk past. He would stop, lean slightly on his walking stick, and tip his faded felt hat. "Good morning to you, Miss Stoltzfus," he would say, his voice carrying a calm, resonant timbre. "May the day be a kindly one." He would then continue his walk without waiting for a long response. It was a simple, repetitive acknowledgement, a daily confirmation that she was seen, recognized, and accepted as a permanent fixture on the ridge. These small, quiet interactions wove a subtle, necessary net of community around the stone tower, anchoring her to the landscape in a way that the heavy iron bolts never could. The ground floor of the mill rested on massive, hand-hewn oak joists, but beneath those heavy timbers lay the foundation pit, a deep, circular excavation lined with unmortared stone that housed the heavy lower drive gears and provided access to the base of the massive central windshaft. For the first few months, Anna had avoided the pit. The heavy wooden trapdoor in the floor was swollen tight kept-to-hat dampness, and the dark space below smelled strongly of stagnant water, rot, and decades of accumulated earth. But as the weather warmed and the ground thawed, she knew she had to inspect the lower gears before she could even consider repairing the external sails. A seized lower gear would tear the entire structure apart the moment the wind caught the new canvas. She used a heavy iron pry bar to force the thick wooden trapdoor open, the rusted iron hinges screaming in protest. The air that rose from the pit was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of wet stone. She lowered a heavy wooden ladder into the darkness, tied a rope around the handle of her kerosene lantern, and descended slowly. The foundation pit was a cramped, frightening space, the massive stone walls pressing in close. The floor was packed, damp earth. The massive iron gears, thick with hardened grease and dirt, loomed like dormant beasts in the flickering light. She spent the entire day in the cold dampness, using a heavy wire brush and gallons of degreaser to meticulously clean the massive teeth of the great spur wheel. It was filthy, exhausting labor, her hands covered in thick black sludge that refused to wash off. It was late in the afternoon. While she was digging away a heavy accumulation of packed dirt near the base of the central shaft to clear the lowest bearing, that her small iron trowel struck something hard that was not stone. The sound was a dull, hollow thud against wood. Anna stopped digging. She moved the lantern closer, illuminating the corner of the dark pit. Protruding slightly from the packed dirt, wedged tightly beneath a heavy stone footer, was the edge of a perfectly round, flat piece of wood. She used her hands to carefully clear the dirt away. It was a heavy cedar disc, roughly 10 inches in diameter. The wood was remarkably preserved in the cool, damp earth. Carved deeply into the center of the cedar, the cuts still sharp and deliberate, was the unmistakable shape of a stylized windmill sail, its 4 curved arms enclosed in a perfect circle. She wedged the sharp end of her trowel under the edge of the thick cedar disc and pried upward. It resisted, held tight by the suction of the damp earth, before finally popping loose with a wet sound. Beneath the disc was a small, square void in the packed dirt, lined with flat, carefully arranged slate stones. Resting inside the void was a small, heavy box made of dark, quarter-sawn oak. The wood was perfectly intact. protected by the slate and the natural rot resistance of the cedar cover. The box was sealed with a small brass latch. Anna lifted the box out of the void. It was surprisingly heavy. She carried it up the wooden ladder. Stepping out onto the warm, polished pine floor of the main room, blinking in the bright late afternoon sunlight. She set the box on the heavy wooden workbench and flipped the small brass latch. Inside, resting on a bed of dry, faded green velvet, were two objects. The first was a heavy solid brass key approximately 3 inches long. The metal was heavily tarnished, carrying the dark patina of extreme age. The long shank was thick and heavily grooved, indicating a complex lock mechanism. But it was the bow of the key, the rounded part meant to be held by the fingers, that drew her attention. It was cast in the exact shape of a windmill sail, matching the carving on the cedar disc perfectly. The intricate details of the small brass sails were smooth and worn from use. The second object was a small, stiff piece of heavy cardstock. It was a tintype photograph, the dark, metallic image possessing a sharp, haunting clarity. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, standing in front of the massive stone walls of the mill. The woman was not dressed in formal Victorian clothing. She wore a heavy practical canvas apron over a simple dark dress. Her hair was pulled back tightly. In her right hand she held the exact same heavy hand-forged iron millstone pick that Anna had found inside the massive runner stone. The young woman in the photograph stared directly into the lens with a look of profound, immovable determination, her posture radiating strength and absolute ownership of the space around. Anna carefully turned the stiff metal photograph over. Written on the back, in a faded but elegant script, were a few words. Martha Miller, daughter of Jacob, age Jaime Lum, summer of Mortneen Cheen Bar. Anna stared at the photograph, tracing the dark, severe lines of Martha Miller's face. She realized then that the history of this massive stone tower was not just a lineage of men. It was a lineage of strength, of people who understood the demanding nature of the stone and the wind, regardless of their gender. Martha Miller had held that heavy iron pick over a century ago, standing on the very ground Anna was now working to restore. She placed the tintype photograph carefully back into the oak box. She picked up the heavy brass key. She walked over to the massive fieldstone hearth, the center of warmth and light in the large room. She placed the key exactly in the center of the heavy, rough-hewn oak mantelpiece. She did not canoe ve kep what lock the heavy brass key opened. She had searched every door, every cabinet, every heavy wooden chest in the mill. The lock remained hidden, but the key felt important, a tangible link to the woman in the photograph. The brass key would sit exactly in that spot, gathering dust and catching the morning light for many months. The transition from the brutal Pennsylvania winter into spring was not a sudden, gentle thaw, but a slow, muddy and chaotic shift in the landscape. The deep frost heaved the crushed gravel of High Ridge Road, creating deep ruts that held freezing, opaque puddles. The air, which had been sharply defined by the scent of wood smoke and dry cold, grew heavy and damp, smelling profoundly of vacapite earth, decaying leaves, and the first hesitant shoots of green cutting through the brown field. The massive white oak trees surrounding the mill, which had stood like bare, skeletal sentinels for months, began to push tiny, pale green buds from their dark, gnarly branches. The prevailing winds shifted, losing their biting, arctic edge and carrying instead the heavy, humid promise of thunderstorms rolling off the Appalachian ridges. The sound of the valley changed. The harsh, rhythmic howling of the winter wind was replaced by the constant, low roar of the swollen creeks carrying the snowmelt down toward the Susquehanna. Anna spent the spring engaged in the quiet, necessary work of stabilization. The structural integrity of the stone tower was secure, the roof was tight, the chimney drew perfectly. The windows were sealed against the rain, and the massive pine floors were clean and protected. The building was no longer a derelict ruin, it was a functional, sheltered space. But she did not immediately order heavy canvas for the sails. She did not attempt to engage the massive, complicated wooden gears in the foundation pit. She did not pick up the heavy iron millstone pick and attempt to dress the valuable French burr stones. She knew she was not ready. The machinery of a commercial grist mill is incredibly powerful and entirely unfamiliar. Silas had taught her the basic mechanics, but she lacked the deep, instinctual understanding that Jacob Miller had written about in his letter. The ability to feel the exact tension in the stone, to read the subtle shifts in the wind speed, to know exactly when to engage the brake before the friction caused the wooden frame to shudder and tear itself apart. Attempting to run the mill without that knowledge was not just foolish, it was a violation of the respect the heavy machinery demanded. Instead, she dedicated the spring to study. She spent her days sitting at the heavy wooden workbench, the light streaming through the newly restored windows, poring over Jacob Miller's thick leather-bound log. She traced his sharp, forward-leaning script, studying the precise ratios he had recorded, the specific angles of the sails required for different wind speeds, the exact dressing patterns required for different types of grain. She walked the perimeter of the property, learning how the wind moved across the specific topography of the ridge, identifying the subtle dead zones and the powerful updraft. She spent her evenings cleaning and oiling every single iron hand tool left in the mill, learning the specific weight and balance of each instrument. She was building a foundation of knowledge, a slow, deliberate accumulation of understanding that mirrored the slow, deliberate work of repointing the massive fieldstone chimney. The restoration of the physical structure was complete, but the restoration of the craft, the complex, vital relationship between the miller, the stone, and the wind, was just beginning. She was 25 years old. The medical debt was gone. The frantic, exhausting race for survival was over. She sat by the hearth one evening in late May, listening to the heavy spring rain battering the thick stone walls, feeling the deep, resonant strength of the structure surrounding her. The stone tower had stood on the ridge for over a century, enduring storms, drought, and the slow, grinding passage of time. The stone windmill was patient. So was she. The first true test of the massive stones did not occur that spring, nor the following summer. It was 2 full winters later. On a sharp, clear morning in early November, when the wind off the ridge was steady and cold. The heavy wooden sails, massive structures of white oak and tightly laced, storm-weight canvas, had been meticulously rebuilt and mounted to the heavy windshaft by Elias Thorne and a crew of local carpenters the previous summer. The lower gears had been cleaned, aligned, and greased. The massive French burr stones had been carefully dressed by Anna, the complex geometric furrows restored to their original shearing depth using the heavy, hand-forged iron pick. Anna stood on the second-floor grinding deck, her hand resting on the heavy wooden hopper. The entire timber frame of the mill was vibrating, a deep, powerful thrumming that resonated in her chest. The sound was deafening, the steady, rhythmic roar of the massive stones turning against each other. She watched the grain feed down from the hopper, feeling the heavy wooden casing for the subtle, terrifying vibrations that would indicate the stones were unbalanced or striking too hard. But the vibration remained smooth and powerful. The air in the loft filled with the fine white mist of flour, settling like frost on her clothes and her hair. She reached her hand down to the wooden chute where the finished product was expelled. She caught a handful of the fine white powder, rubbing it between her thumb and forefinger. It was cool to the touch, perfectly uniform, the texture exact and precise. It was not burned, it was not coarse. It was the first perfect batch of flour the Miller grist mill had produced in over 50 years. The final state of the restored interior was a testament to the slow, relentless application of physical labor and historical respect. The massive circular space on the ground floor was clean and bright, the amber glow of the wide pine planks reflecting the light from the restored double-paned window. The fieldstone chimney stood solid and secure, the firebox black with heavy use, providing a constant, reliable source of heat against the bitter winter winds. The heavy oak beams overhead, once sagging and compromised, were straight and tight, carrying the immense weight of the grinding machinery with quiet, unyielding strength. It was not a modernized space. It lacked electricity and running water, but it possessed a functional, beautiful utility that felt incredibly permanent. It was during the final cleanup of the property perimeter, clearing the overgrown brush from the base of the massive trees lining the ridge, that she finally solved the mystery of the heavy brass key. She was working near the massive trunk of a black walnut tree that stood on the very edge of the property line, its thick, gnarly roots gripping the rocky soil. The tree was ancient, easily predating the mill itself. As she cut away a thick tangle of invasive ivy near the base of the trunk, her clippers struck metal. She pushed the ivy back, revealing a small, thick brass plate bolted directly into the hard, dark wood of the tree. The bark had grown heavily around the edges of the plate, nearly obscuring it over the decades. In the center of the plate was a wide, heavily grooved keyhole. Anna ran back to the mill, grabbed the heavy brass key from its resting place on the mantel, and returned to the massive walnut tree. She knelt in the dirt, her heart beating fast. The key slid into the groove perfectly. She grasped the heavy, sail-shaped bow and turned it firmly to the right. The lock resisted for a moment, the internal tumblers stiff with age, before giving way with a heavy metallic clack. She pulled on the key, and the small brass door, cleverly disguised to blend with the dark bark, swung open, revealing a dry, hollow cavity carved deep into the living wood of the tree. Inside the cavity rested a small bundle wrapped in heavy, oiled canvas, identical to the bundles she had found inside the millstone. She pulled the bundle free and unwrapped it on the frozen ground. Inside was a tightly folded, heavy cotton flag. She carefully unfolded the stiff material, revealing the brilliant, faded colors of an American flag. She counted the stars stitched into the dark blue canton. There were exactly 48 stars, the arrangement confirming the flag's age. Folded inside the center of the heavy cotton flag was a small piece of stiff parchment paper. The handwriting was different from Jacob Miller's sharp script. It was softer, looping, and elegant. For my boy, David, who carries the heart of the stone across the dark water. The roots of this tree are deep, and the wind will always bring you home. Martha Miller. October Murray Bone. Motnin Chin Mui Tam. The note was written by the young woman in the tintype photograph, David S. Mother, written exactly 1 month before the armistice that ended the war. She had carved the cavity and sealed the flag as a physical anchor for her son while he fought in the poisoned mud of the Argonne Forest. The date matched the day he had saved the 4 men and earned the Silver Star. Anna carefully refolded the flag and the note. She placed the heavy brass key back in her pocket. She understood the full weight of the inheritance now. The mill was not just a place of industry, it was a monument to the complex, devastating history of the family that had built it. On the 11th of November, the anniversary of the armistice, Anna took the small velvet box containing the Silver Star Medal to the old county cemetery located behind the Methodist church in the valley. She walked past rows of weathered headstones until she found the small, simple granite marker belonging to David Miller. The stone was covered in pale green lichen, tilted slightly in the soft earth. She did not clear the lichen away. She simply knelt in the damp grass and placed the bronze medal securely at the base of the stone, wedging it tight against the granite where the wind could not take it. She sat there for an hour, the cold autumn wind blowing through the bare branches, honouring the broken miller. The massive cache of vintage currency, the $40,000 Jacob Miller had sealed in the stone, remained largely untouched. Anna had used only the exact amount required for the critical structural repairs: the white oak timbers, the heavy canvas for the sails, the glass for the windows, and the historical mortar material. The rest of the money, over $35,000, was carefully repacked into the heavy vinyl dry bag. She returned to the second floor of the mill, removed the heavy wooden cover panels from the massive runner stone, and placed the bag back inside the hollow centre of the French bourg. She did not seal it verkepite hart plaster. She left it accessible, preserved in the cold stone, a silent, powerful reserve waiting for the next disaster, the next broken roof, or the next generation. The reopening of the commercial mill was not announced with fanfare or advertising. Anna simply walked into Doris Kaufman's diner one Tuesday morning and pinned a small, white index card to the corkboard near the cash register. Stoltzfus Mill on High Ridge. Custom stone ground flour and meal. Bring your own sacks. Within 2 weeks, the local farmers began making the drive up the steep, rutted dirt track. They came in battered pickup trucks, bringing sacks of hard winter wheat and field corn, watching quietly as the young woman engaged the massive wooden brake and let the heavy sails catch the wind. They watched the massive stones turn, listened to the steady, powerful vibration, and felt the fine, perfectly ground flour pour from the chute. Word spread quickly through the county. By the following spring, Anna had a mailing list of over 40 regular customers, including local bakeries and specialty markets down in Lancaster, who recognized the superior quality of the cold-ground, stone-milled product. The mill was no longer a silent ruin. It was a vital, functioning organ of the regional agricultural economy. One Saturday afternoon in late summer, Caleb, the quiet farm boy who had delivered the firewood during the first brutal spring, drove his battered red pickup truck up to the mill. He didn't have firewood in the bed of the truck this time. He carried a large, heavy piece of thick, sanded cherry wood under his arm. He walked up to the heavy oak door where Anna was sweeping the stone dust from the threshold. He didn't say a word. He simply turned the heavy piece of cherry wood around and held it up. He had spent months carving the sign by hand. The letters were cut deep into the dark wood, precise and perfectly spaced, filled with a stark white enamel paint that stood out sharply against the cherry grain. Anna looked at the sign, her eyes lingering on the final word. "Daughters," she said softly.